If you believe America needs to rethink its efforts towards making a better world, the next 29 minutes and 8 seconds are extremely important. For over a quarter of a century now, you've been hearing about trickle-down wealth and supply-side economics. As we're about to find out, there are real reasons why these ideas now sound like a broken, worn-out record. Most important, though, these reasons create a new economic perspective that can provide the millennial generation with its own economic philosophy to champion and to change the world with. It's time to start understanding what that perspective is, how it works, and why it is ideally suited to addressing the enormous challenges the millennials are facing as the next power and leadership generation. To begin understanding, we have to revisit very quickly the beginning. For much of modern history, money has been equated with precious metals, gold and silver. Nations' paper currencies were convertible on demand to a specific amount of gold. The numbers of paper dollars that could be printed by any sovereign country were therefore limited by the amount of gold that could back them up. All this changed in 1971 when the French president, Charles de Gaulle, began demanding the United States exchange its gold for the U.S. dollars held in France. President Richard Nixon responded by taking the U.S. and consequently the rest of the world off the gold standard. At the time, this was seen as temporary, but it soon evolved into the first permanent abandonment of the gold standard in modern times. Nearly half a century ago, then, the United States and the rest of the major economies of the world entered the first permanent era of pure fiat money. The word fiat comes from the Latin, meaning by decree. Fiat money, then, is money created by the legal decree of a sovereign government. Most notable, fiat money is not convertible on demand to anything other than itself. The surprising thing is that everyone, for all these many decades, has continued to believe and behave as if nothing had changed. All the rules and procedures put in place to prevent the federal government from printing more dollars than it could back up with its hoard of gold were left unaltered. As a result, the gold standard, in effect, was replaced with a set of norms and conventions that have no logical connection with the real world of modern fiat money we live in today. Let's see why. Here is a diagram of what those norms and conventions cause us to see and believe when we think about the world of money. We have two pots filled with dollars. One pot is the private sector, the PS pot. This is all the businesses, families, state and local governments in the national economy. The other pot is the federal government, the FG pot. The diagram is telling us the federal government gets its dollars for federal spending via two spigots in the PS pot, the taxes spigot and the borrowing spigot. It appears the dollars the FG taxes and borrows are created in the PS pot. There is no indication, however, how that occurs. What the diagram seems to make clear is that the taxes should not take too many dollars out of the PS pot. Otherwise, the private sector businesses will not have enough dollars left to expand and create jobs. It also seems evident that the FG must limit the number of dollars it borrows from the PS pot. Someday it will have to repay those dollars, and in the meantime, it has to pay interest on what it has borrowed. If the FG borrows too much, it will have to collect more in taxes to pay the interest than can be safely taken out of the PS pot. A limited and finite number of dollars, then, can be taxed and borrowed from the PS pot in any given budget year. What are the consequences imposed by this diagram? As entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, etc., grow larger, discretionary spending, bridge repairs, weather satellites, medical research, etc., has to shrink. If that doesn't happen, if we don't rein in the FG's out-of-control borrowing and spending, we'll eventually drain all the dollars from the PS pot and have to borrow huge sums of dollars from China. This will wreck our economy. This, then, is a diagram of what could be called the ideology of money scarcity. It's a diagram that makes budgeting dollars for federal spending an unending, contentious argument. But is this an accurate diagram of the modern fiat money the United States has actually been using now for nearly half a century? Let's see. The first thing we have to notice is that something important has been left out of the diagram. The FG spending arrows don't just disappear into a netherland. The FG spending goes somewhere. It gets paid to somebody. In fact, the U.S. government buys its goods and services from U.S. citizens and businesses. The dollars the FG spends go back into the PS pot. This is, to say the least, an important detail. But we still have the same budgeting dilemma. We are still compelled to minimize the dollars the FG taxes out of the PS pot. Leaving as many dollars as possible in the PS pot is still necessary to help businesses expand and create jobs. We also still need to minimize the dollars the government borrows from the PS pot, because we have to keep interest payments under control so the FG doesn't have to further increase taxes. Minimizing taxes and borrowing requires squeezing what we can undertake and accomplish as a collective society. This diagram still makes creating budgets for national spending difficult and contentious, but it seems like a reality we're stuck with, except there's one important detail that's left out, one critical detail the diagram doesn't address or explain. If it's true that only the U.S. sovereign government can issue and print U.S. fiat dollars, how do they get into the PS pot in the first place? Our diagram is telling us the dollars are somehow created first by the PS pot itself. But anyone who prints U.S. dollars other than the federal government is a counterfeiter. When you use an ATM machine, the dollars that pop out were not printed by the bank whose logo is on the machine. They were printed by the U.S. federal government. The reality is that U.S. fiat dollars have to get created in the FG pot first, and the federal government has to spend them into the PS pot. Our diagram, then, has been upside down. Only after the FG has issued and spent its fiat dollars into the PS pot can the FG collect those dollars as taxes. But this raises a crucial question. For the FG to spend its fiat dollars into the PS pot, the citizens and businesses in the PS pot must be willing to exchange real goods and services for those fiat dollars. Why would they do that? Back in the days of yore, when the FG's dollars could be exchanged on demand for gold, it's easy to understand why citizens would provide their labor and goods for the FG's dollars. But today, those pure fiat dollars cannot be converted to anything but themselves. So why do they have a value that makes citizens and businesses want to have them? The answer is because we, the citizens, have given the sovereign government the authority to require us to pay something to it on a regular basis, taxes. If we don't or cannot pay the taxes we owe, we have also given the sovereign government the authority to put us in jail. And the only things the sovereign government will accept as a tax payment are the fiat dollars it has issued and spent into the PS pot. It will not accept gold or pesos or bushels of wheat. It will only accept U.S. fiat dollars as a tax payment. There's a strong incentive, therefore, for every American citizen and business to earn a good number of the fiat dollars the federal government issues. As a result, the sovereign's fiat dollars quite naturally become the people's currency of exchange. In other words, their money. What's important to understand is what all this means a fiat dollar actually is. This is so important to our diagram, let's look at it in the simplest terms we can. We all understand what an IOU is. Here, I'm promising to give you a hug when you present to me this IOU. When the IOU is presented to the issuer, the promised hug is given. And the IOU is canceled. When we look at this side of our diagram, we can see that the fiat dollars issued by the FG are, in fact, IOUs. Each fiat dollar is saying, I, the U.S. government, owe you, the bearer of this dollar, $1 worth of canceled federal taxes. And that promise is fulfilled on the other side of our diagram when the dollars are presented to the FG as tax payments. What's important to see is this. When the FG's IOU, its fiat dollar, is presented to pay $1 worth of taxes owed, the taxes are marked paid, and the IOU is canceled. To get our diagram right, we now have to ask, of what use is the canceled IOU to the federal government? Why is our diagram showing the FG harvesting something which it is capable of creating at any time by simply saying, I owe you? A more accurate diagram shows the FG issuing its tax IOUs, 1, spending them into the PS pot, 2, and then draining them from the PS pot as canceled tax IOUs. The canceled tax IOUs, fiat dollars, do not go back into the FG pot. Instead, they are simply drained out of the PS pot. The FG doesn't need the canceled IOUs in order to issue and spend new fiat dollars. There are a couple of important things to notice now about our new diagram. The first is that if we convince our sovereign government that we should not pay taxes, the FG's sovereign spending would soon fill the PS pot to overflowing with fiat dollars. This could cause the problem of price inflation, which economic advisors are constantly warning us about. Continuously removing fiat dollars from the PS pot through a tax drain, therefore, is what enables the FG to continue to issue and spend its tax IOUs, fiat dollars, without creating price inflation. How many dollars to drain each year, and which businesses and citizens should provide what portion of them, is a topic for thoughtful debate. But that doesn't prevent us from having a correct diagram about the modern fiat money we've actually been using now for nearly 50 years. Next, we have to ask, can it be true that all of the dollars making transactions in the PS pot come from sovereign spending? In fact, something more complex is happening in the PS pot. The private banking industry, in coordination with the sovereign central bank, leverages the FG's fiat dollars into loan dollars. On any given day, then, bank loan dollars expand the actual amount of money the private sector economy needs to make all the transactions the citizens and businesses decide they want to make. Loan dollars issued by banks are indistinguishable from real sovereign fiat dollars because the FG promises to convert them on demand into real fiat dollars, and the FG always keeps its promise. When the bank loans are repaid, the loan dollars are simply canceled to be replaced with new loan dollars as necessary. In other words, the sovereign central bank and the private banking system cooperate and coordinate to keep the number of fiat dollars in the PS pot equal to what is needed for the economy's transactions. We now have to explain why a prominent feature of the diagram we started out with is missing: the borrowing spigot. Should we put it back? And if so, where should we put it? Reviewing what we've just understood about tax dollars, we can now see there is no logical reason for the FG to borrow its own tax IOUs. Why would it need to borrow something it can create any time it wants by simply saying, I owe you? But that begs the question, if the federal government doesn't need to borrow its own fiat dollars, why does it sell Treasury bonds? Treasury bonds play an important and complicated role in the coordination between the central bank and the private banking system. But to get our diagram right, we don't need to go into all those complex details. All we need to see is that, in fact, a Treasury bond is just like a certificate of deposit at our bank. Fiat dollars do not earn interest. But if we put them in a certificate of deposit, a CD account at our bank, they do earn interest. In exchange for that interest, we agree to keep the dollars in the CD for a specified period of time. This is exactly the same agreement with a U.S. Treasury bond. Dollars are transferred from the PS pot into the Treasury bond savings account, where they earn interest. And where they must stay for a specified period of time. During that time, we can see that a very large number of dollars are effectively sequestered in the Treasury Bond savings account and replaced with a much smaller number of dollars, the interest payments, made into the PS pot. We can see now the FG has two methods for controlling price inflation in the PS pot: draining dollars through taxes and sequestering dollars in Treasury bond savings accounts. And now we've added to our diagram an inflation meter to monitor the prices in the PS pot. If necessary, the tax drain and the Treasury bond accounts can be adjusted to bring prices under control. It is also extremely important to see that when a Treasury bond matures, the dollars in the bond account are simply transferred back into the PS pot. These are not dollars the FG is having to repay. They are simply being transferred from one account to another. More often than not, these dollars are immediately transferred back into a new Treasury bond so they can continue to earn free interest. Now we have to address something that looks odd about our diagram. There are no dollars flowing into the FG pot. Dollars flow into the PS pot via the sovereign spending and interest spigots. Dollars flow back and forth between the PS pot and the Treasury bond account chamber, and dollars are drained out of the tax drain. But no dollars are flowing into the FG pot itself. How can that be? We already know the answer. The sovereign federal government has no need to harvest what it can create on its own anytime it needs to. The FG, then, is not a pot at all in the sense that something can be put into it. It is simply a currency issuing machine. You don't have to put anything into it to get sovereign fiat dollars out of it. We can now consider what is the most remarkable thing about our new diagram. When the FG issues and spends its fiat dollars into the PS pot, it is, in fact, paying American citizens to create goods and services which they collectively benefit from. All those things we just glimpsed are hard to diagram, but we can do it like this. What we're showing is that sovereign spending pays citizens and businesses to build and create things that support private sector society and local economies in many ways. Not only do citizens and businesses earn dollars to deposit in their bank accounts, they also get to share in the benefits of the goods and services they've created. This is the remarkable coincidence of our diagram of modern fiat money. And it is the heart of the economic opportunity the millennials now have at their disposal, if they choose to understand and champion it. There's only one more thing we need to do before we put the finishing touches on our new diagram. We need to make sure we're using the right terminology to talk about what the diagram is showing us. For example, we're going to want to discuss and likely measure the difference between what the FG spends each year into the PS pot minus the number of dollars it drains out in taxes. What should we call the difference between these two numbers? Most political leaders and economic commentators using the old diagram we started out with, believe in a balanced federal budget. In a given year, the FG should spend into the PS pot the same number of dollars it drains out in taxes. The net result of a balanced federal budget, as we can see, is that the PS pot ends up with the same financial wealth, savings, it started out with. Unless inflation is a problem, however, limiting the number of dollars spent into the PS pot to equal taxes merely imposes limits on what the private sector can accomplish. In this series of diagrams, Congress has achieved its holy grail, a budget surplus. It has actually succeeded in draining out more dollars in taxes than it spent into the PS pot. The result? In order to maintain their previous levels of spending, their lifestyle, so to speak, families and businesses in the PS pot have to spend their previous savings or borrow bank dollars to make up the difference. This could lead to a shrinking of the private sector economy, a banking crisis, or maybe both. In this last series of diagrams, the FG has spent more dollars into the PS pot than it has drained out in taxes. And what is the result? The families and businesses in the PS pot end up with a net increase in their savings. They can literally save these new dollars, spend them in their local economy, or invest them in new business ventures. This looks good, right? But pinch yourself and realize this is what today, using the old diagram we began with, we call the federal deficit. Since the sovereign spending which created this new savings in the PS pot also paid American citizens and businesses to create collective goods and services we all benefit from, why don't we call this number our net spending achievement? Imagine how our political dialogue will change if, instead of arguing about how big our budget deficit is, we debated instead about what we should be accomplishing with our net spending achievement. There's one final term now we need to fix: our national debt. There's a famous clock in New York City which tallies up, minute by minute, what we are told is the U.S. national debt. The clock is frightening for two reasons. First, the number is huge, and it grows every day. Second, we're told the U.S. taxpayers will someday have to repay this debt. As of now, that's $54,293 owed by each U.S. citizen. How will each of us ever pay back that much money? If we insert this clock into our new diagram, however, we can see that it is measuring something very different than what is a national debt that needs to be repaid to somebody. It is measuring the number of fiat dollars which have been moved from the PS pot, where they earn zero interest, into the Treasury Bond savings accounts. As we understood earlier, these are not dollars the U.S. taxpayer has to pay back to anyone. When the Treasury Bond matures, the dollars in the Treasury Bond savings account are simply moved back into the PS pot. In fact, the clock in New York City is actually our national savings clock. So this is our final diagram of the modern fiat money we actually use today. It may look like a Rube Goldberg contraption, But what it says to us as a collective society, and what it says to the millennial generation now coming to power, is quite remarkable. What we can achieve as a collective society is not dependent upon or limited by the number of fiat dollars our federal government can tax or borrow from the private sector economy. Creating collective goods and services we all benefit from does not take tax dollars out of people's pockets. It puts real sovereign fiat dollars into the pockets of citizens and businesses all across America. The only things that limit what we can accomplish as a collective society are: 1. The common goals we can democratically agree upon, and 2. What real resources, labor, energy, materials, are currently unemployed and available to be put to the task. If you really think about the implications of this, it will change your view of the world and your view of what America could and should be organizing itself to undertake and accomplish as a collective society. My name is J.D. Alt. I invite you to read this book and explore further the remarkable opportunities created by the reality of modern fiat money.